Hello there, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you are new here. My name is Michelle Emerson and I teach fourth grade near Austin, Texas. This past school year, I got asked quite frequently how teaching in Texas is different. So that's what we're gonna dive into today. I'm gonna go over some of the differences I noticed, some of the pros, some of the cons, and give a general reflection at the end. Two things before we jump into this. Number one, it is a super rainy, dreary, cloudy day, so the lighting is not ideal. But as teachers, we know sometimes you just gotta do the best you can with what you have. Second, this is gonna be based solely on my experience. That's really all I have to base it on. But keep in mind that my experience could be vastly different than someone else's. As I have found, you can find a lot of differences not only between states, but even within single districts, depending on the school that you teach, depending on the grade level that you teach. So while I'm gonna be sharing things that I noticed from my experience, keep in mind they are not representative of Texas as a whole or Maryland as a whole. It's just the things that I personally have noticed. So a little bit of background, if you have not been following along for very long and you don't know about my history. As I mentioned, I did start teaching in Maryland. So I started as a second grade teacher on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. Then I moved districts to the Western Shore of Maryland where I taught fourth grade. We were departmentalized, but I taught different subjects every year. So some years it was math and science, some years math, science, social studies, some years math and reading. So I taught a little bit of everything. I taught for a total of 7 years in Maryland. So 3 years in second grade, 4 years in fourth grade. My last year was the 2020-2021 school year where I was teaching hybrid. So half my students in person, half my students online. It was an experience. Then my husband and I relocated to Austin, Texas, and I actually took 3 years off. I left the classroom to write a book and also to travel and provide PD for teachers. This past year, the 2024-2025 school year, was my first year back after that 3-year break. And obviously now I am teaching here in Texas. I was teaching fourth grade math and science. Also, just for a little bit of context about the districts that I'm in and kind of the size and scope. When I taught in Maryland, the last district that I taught at had about 85,000 students and about 120 schools. The district that I am teaching at here in Texas has around 50,000 students and about 60 schools. So I've broken this into 4 different categories: standards, grading, evaluations, and then work responsibilities and compensation. Obviously, there are other areas I could dive into, but I feel like those are the areas I get asked about the most. So let's kick it off with standards. Now, here in Texas, we follow TEACHERS. And I remember before teaching in Texas, I always heard about TEACHERS and I knew there were standards. So if you're not familiar with TEACHERS, it stands for Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. Basically, it's just a set of standards for each subject for each grade level, but it is only used in Texas. When I taught in Maryland, we essentially were using Common Core, but instead of calling it Common Core, they called it the Maryland College and Career Readiness Standards. And then in science, we used NGSS, or Next Generation Science Standards, but for all intents and purposes, it was Common Core. Now, what I have found is standards are standards.
Standard, nothing fancy.
It just tells you what skills or knowledge students need to master or have by the end of the school year. And that's the same pretty much everywhere. The only differences are some of the actual topics that are covered, and then maybe the way that the standard is worded. So for example, back in Maryland in fourth grade math, we taught prime and composite. In fact, it was usually like one of our first units that we did. And here in Texas, prime and composite numbers are actually a 5th grade skill. So we do not teach it in 4th grade, at least during the regular school year or during the curriculum. We, at the very end of the school year, after we take STAR, which we'll come back to that's our big standardized test that we take in the spring, we actually start to prepare our 4th graders for 5th grade math. And so we did cover prime and composite just to get them ready for that. Another big difference I noticed, especially in math, was teaching the multiplication and division algorithm. So in 4th grade here in Texas, we taught the multiplication algorithm and the division algorithm. So that's, if you're watching this and you're, a little bit older, that's the way that we learned, right? Versus in Maryland, we did not teach the standard algorithm for multiplication or division. Those were like 5th and 6th grade skills. Instead, we relied on a lot of other strategies. For example, the area model for multiplication or partial quotients for division. A final difference I noticed within math here in Texas, we actually have a unit called financial literacy, and we teach students about savings accounts and budgeting for things and profit and expenses, whereas in Maryland, that was just never part of the math curriculum. Of course, it would come up during certain projects, but it wasn't something we exclusively had to teach as a part of the standards. Now, with standards typically comes assessments. So as I mentioned, here in Texas, students take STAR, which stands for, oh boy, State of Texas Assessments of Academic Readiness, I think. And then in Maryland, our big standardized test was called MCAP, which I think stood for Maryland Comprehensive Assessment Program. But prior to that, we took PARCC, P-A-R-C-C. Don't remind me what it means because I don't remember. But these are basically the big standardized tests that you would take in the spring. And the actual tests themselves, they're not that different. They have different names. Students would take them on the Chromebooks. The main difference I noticed between teaching in Maryland and teaching in Texas is the emphasis on passing that test. When I taught in Maryland, I felt like they would take the test, parents would see results, school would see results, as teachers we would see results, and that was kind of it. There weren't a lot of negative things that happened if you didn't pass or didn't get a good score. It was just kind of data to look at and to help drive instruction the next year. However, here in Texas, I do feel like there is a very big emphasis placed on passing STAR. And if students do not pass STAR, if they get a did not meet for the grade level expectations, then there are certain things that happen the next year with intervention services, potentially summer school, things like that. And so that's been a big shift for me because it wasn't something I was really used to when I taught back in Maryland. Next, let's move on to grading, because when you have standards, you typically then have grading that you have to get in. So a few kind of bigger level differences that I noticed between Maryland and Texas, although I'm going to be very specific here, I think it's more at the school or district level that these differences really lie. When I taught in Maryland, the last district that I taught in, for math, we actually had 2 different math grades. We had a computational skills grade and a problem solving grade. So if a worksheet or something had multiple problems, we would kind of split them and say these ones were focused on problem solving, these ones were focused on computational skills. And sometimes we would actually get 2 grades out of that one assignment, or we would give specific assignments for computational skills and specific assignments for problem solving. Here in Texas, at least the district that I teach in, math is just 1 grade. It's a math grade. Now, some of the categories within the subject area are different as well. When I taught in Maryland, I know we had a classwork category, test and quiz category, and then I think we had a projects category. Currently here in Texas, the district that I teach in with my school, we have a daily assignment category. That's basically like your classwork. We have assessments category, and then we also have homework. And yes, we do grade homework. That was another big difference for me. Back in Maryland, we typically gave homework because we had to, but it wasn't graded. Now, we would still keep track of who turned it in, who didn't, but it was not factored into their grade, whereas where I teach now, we do grade homework. Now, at one point, I know my school actually stopped giving homework, and they were actually asked by the community to continue giving homework for that practice. And again, a lot of it is kind of geared towards the preparation for STAR. So honestly, it's one of those things where I'm like, there are pluses and minuses either way. I know homework is a very hot topic in education. I know a lot of people are not fans of homework, and for the longest time, I wasn't either. I will say though, I saw a lot of benefits of giving homework this past school year, and it depends a lot on your school community, your students, But I did find that for the most part, a majority of my class completed their homework week in and week out. It just became a routine that we continuously did. Another few differences in terms of grading the actual assignments. When I taught in Maryland, we would always come up with a point value for an assignment. So like this is 10 points or 15 points or 20 points. And we would typically write their score out of that number of points. So you got an 8 out of 10. We would write the percentage as well, like this was an 80%, but when we inputted it into the grade book, we would put that it was out of 15 points and we would just put their raw score. Currently, where I teach, we actually put everything in terms of 100 points. So everything is a percentage. Even if we may be grading an assignment out of say 20 points, ultimately the score is just gonna be the percentage. So if they got a 19 out of 20, the focus is gonna be that's a 95, and when I input it into the grade book, I'm gonna input it as a 95. That took a little bit of kind of getting used to for me. Another difference is with redos. The district that I taught at in Maryland, students could redo up to 3 assignments per subject area per marking period, and those assignments had to be below a 70. So if a student got a 60 on an assignment, they could redo it and they could earn, see, this is where I can't remember. I can't remember if they would earn up to a 70 or if they would just earn the higher score. From what I remember, I think they just earned the higher score, but they were limited to only redoing up to 3 assignments. So they kind of had to be strategic with which ones they chose. Now, here in Texas where I teach, students can redo any assignment that they score below a 70 on, but the highest score they can earn is a 70. So basically, anytime a student gets below a 70, that assignment is going to get redone. I facilitate that with my students with the majority of their classwork assignments, but sometimes there are assignments that they have to like take home and redo just due to like time constraints, or maybe it was more of like a homework assignment. It's like, hey, you can redo it, but you're gonna work on it at home. Another difference is extra credit. That was never an option when I was teaching back in Maryland, at least at our school and district. Whereas now our students can complete an extra credit assignment for each subject area, each marking period. So we actually posted on like our grade level website what the assignment is. Usually it's pretty project based and it's something they complete on their own. There's a deadline to turn it in, typically about 2 weeks before the end of the marking period. And if students earn full points on that extra credit assignment, they will get 20 additional points on whatever their lowest daily grade was for that subject for that marking period. So let's say they had gotten a 70 on one of their daily assignments, they complete the extra credit, that 70 would then go up to a 90. And the last really big difference that I personally noticed is with report cards. And again, I think this is more of a school difference. When I taught in Maryland, we had to write, there were certain comments we always had to include on report cards, but then we had to write very individualized comments on report cards. And as a result, report card time was kind of stressful. It was something you dreaded because it would take a lot of time. Now, where I teach, we don't really add report card comments, mostly because we keep such good communication with families throughout the marking period that by the time the report card goes out, they're already familiar with their student, how they did, strengths, areas of growth, etc. So when it's report card time, it's basically just loading in my grades. Of course, I can add in comments, but it's not something that's required. So it's a much less stressful time of the year. The next category is going to be evaluations. Now, this refers to, as a teacher, how am I evaluated?
How do I know you're qualified to evaluate me?
Here in Texas, we utilize something called TEACHERS, which stands for Texas Teachers Evaluations, Supports and Systems, or something like that. All of these acronyms, I'm telling y'all. Basically, you get a summative evaluation at the end of the year that is based on a formal observation, 2 walkthroughs, and your student growth goal, as well as your like professional practice, which you as a teacher kind of have input on. We'll come back to that. Now in Maryland, we didn't have a fancy acronym for it, but again, we would get a summative evaluation. However, especially if you were not tenured, it was based on 2 observations. 1 was formal, 1 was informal, 2 SLOs, which stood for Student Learning Objective, but it was essentially that student growth goal that you're setting, and then again, input from the teacher on your overall professional practice. So for pretty much everywhere I've taught, at the end of the year, I've been asked as a teacher to fill out a Google form, just informing my administration of PD that I did, areas of growth that I was focusing on, how I interacted with my colleagues, how I lesson planned, things like that, which usually they have a pretty good idea, but it's my chance to kind of give them information that maybe they don't know. So that was the same in both places. With the student growth goal or the student learning objective, here in Texas, we just did 1 for the school year. In Maryland, we had to do 2. If you're not familiar, that's basically where you choose like a standard or a certain score with your students that you want to improve. You have like pre-assessment data, you implement a plan of certain instruction or strategies you're gonna try, and then at the end, there's like a post-assessment and you are trying to achieve a certain growth goal that you set. That has been pretty similar in both spots. The only difference was we had to do 2 of them back in Maryland, whereas here we only did 1. And then for observations in Maryland, we would have a formal observation. That one was announced. You knew when administration was coming. You had to fill out a formal lesson plan. Mine would usually be like 5 to 6 pages by the time I was done. And then you would have an informal observation. This one was unannounced, but I'm using air quotes because usually you kind of had a heads up that they were coming, and you didn't have to submit a lesson plan, but they would just come kind of watch a lesson on the fly. Here, we only had 1 formal lesson observation where we had to write a lesson plan, although it was much less. It was only about a page. And you knew the time that they were coming. You would go in for like a pre-conference, post-conference, all of that. Then you had 2 walkthroughs. Now the walkthroughs, again, they're unannounced, but they were a much shorter time versus in Maryland, the informal observation would be like a whole lesson, usually 45 minutes to an hour. These walkthroughs were more like 15 to 20 minutes. But overall, the structure was fairly similar. Now, I will say, I have never, as a teacher, had a, what I'm gonna call non-observation year. In Maryland, you would be observed until you got tenure, and then the first year after tenure. So when I taught 2nd grade on the Eastern Shore, I taught for 3 years. I would have had tenure at the start of my 4th year, but because I moved districts, I had to restart. When I was teaching in that new district, I taught there for 4 years, so I did get tenure, but your first year after tenure is an observation year, so I was observed again. And then obviously now I'm here in Texas, so it's kind of reset as well. And honestly, I'm not sure exactly what that looks like here in Texas. It'll be one of those things that I kind of learn. But I know in Maryland, after your 4th year, like your 5th year, you wouldn't have an observation that year. I've never experienced that. And the final category is going to be work responsibilities and compensation. So this refers to kind of the hours that I work as a teacher, what is included, what's not, how am I compensated, how does the pay compare from Maryland to Texas? So let's just start off with the pay, because I know people are probably curious. I will say I took a fairly significant pay cut when I moved from Maryland to Texas in terms of teaching. Basically $12,000 less. So when I was teaching in Maryland, I made about $12,000 more than I currently do. It's interesting because in Maryland, there were different, at least the districts I taught in, there were different pay scales. And so, for example, when you got your master's degree, you would move up a pay scale, and that included about a $5,000 pay increase. Whereas where I am teaching right now in Texas, it's just a $1,000 stipend for having your master's degree. So I do have my master's degree, that gives me an extra $1,000. They also did honor my years of service, which I really appreciated. So when I started teaching here in Texas, they honored my 7 years of teaching experience from Maryland. So I was able to start a little bit lower down on the pay scale, which is great. But even then, comparing, if I were at that same point on the pay scale in Maryland, I would be making about $12,000 more. But I do think it's important to note that the cost of living here is cheaper. Not significantly cheaper, but it is cheaper. Also, we have something coming called TIA, which stands for Teacher Incentive Allotment. Now, I have mentioned in prior videos, and people were kind of like, wait, what? That after this school year, we are gonna be self-contained. So this next school year, I'm still teaching math and science. After that, I will be teaching math, science, social studies, and reading. And that is due to the Teacher Incentive Allotment. It's basically a chance for us to earn extra money depending on how students score on certain assessments. I'm gonna have to do a whole video on that, so I'm not gonna get into that now, but it will give me the opportunity to kind of make up a little bit of that pay difference. Now, in terms of the overall benefits, they're pretty similar, like number of days you get for sick leave, personal leave, insurance, all of that pretty much the same. I will say the contracted number of days that I work is slightly different. So in Maryland, our contract included 191 work days for teachers. Here, I am contracted to teach 187 days. So it is about 4 days less. And obviously our days within the school year are very different. In Maryland, we would start with students at least after Labor Day. So as teachers, we would typically go back like the week before Labor Day. We would have that long Labor Day weekend, and then students would start back. So students weren't starting until the beginning of September. Whereas here, we start back pretty early in August. So teachers start back like right at the beginning of August, and then students are starting by like the middle, second to third week of August. But that also means we get out much earlier. So here in Texas, we were out before the last week of May, before Memorial Day, whereas in Maryland, we would typically go until like the middle of June. I think the latest I ever got out was like June 22nd or 23rd. The breaks are also a little bit different. So in Maryland, for fall break, we would just get Wednesday, Thursday, Friday off around Thanksgiving. Here, at least the district I currently teach in, we get that full week off for fall break. And y'all, I was so excited because I had never had a full week off for fall break. Winter break is pretty similar, typically about 2 weeks off. In Maryland, for spring break, at least most of the years, we would just have the Friday and then Monday around Easter off, whereas here in Texas, we get a full week for spring break, but it is not necessarily around like Easter time. It's earlier in the year. So it is really nice getting those breaks, but I feel like we have less kind of random days off, whereas in Maryland, we would have random days off, or like we had a lot of half days. That's another big difference. In Maryland, we would have days where for the teachers, it would be a full day. The students would only come to school for the morning. So it was a half day of school, although I think it technically counted as a full day. But then we would have the afternoon for like professional development or working on report cards or conferences, etc. Whereas here, we don't have half days in the calendar, and conferences, we just schedule like on our own time. We don't have designated days off for them, but in Maryland, that was built into the calendar. Another big difference has to do with the delayed starts, and I think it has to do probably with the weather. In Maryland, we had 90-minute delay days back when I first started teaching. Then my other district, it was either an hour delay or 2 hours delay, and that just meant we started an hour or 2 hours later in the morning, typically due to fog. We would get a lot of fog. There would be a lot of bad car accidents. And so we would delay the start of school in order to allow the fog to clear. Here, that just doesn't exist. We don't have delayed openings. It's not a thing. Also back in Maryland, we typically had 5 inclement weather days built into our calendar. So those were basically for snow or other inclement weather where we would have off school. If we did not use all 5 days, then we would get out of school a little bit earlier. Here, at least to my knowledge, we don't really have inclement weather days built into the calendar, although they do still happen, because here, if you get a little teeny tiny bit of snow flurries, school's probably gonna shut down. Whereas in Maryland, it was more like if you got 3 to 4 inches of snow, then school would be closed that day. Okay, in terms of actual work hours, let's see if I can remember my schedule. Back in Maryland, my last district, as teachers, we had to be there no later than 8:15, but students didn't come in until they would come in from like 9:30 to 9:55. That was their like start time in the morning. And then 9:55 was the actual start of the school day. So we typically had about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes before students arrived. That was usually meetings or planning time. So of the 5 days of the week, usually like 3 of those days were meetings that we would attend. The other 2 days would be additional planning time for us, which was really nice. Now, because the students didn't start until later, that meant that the school day ended later, usually around 4 o'clock-ish. Whereas here, the district I currently teach in, the teacher start time is the same as the student arrival time, around 7:15 a.m. And then the actual day starts around 7:30, and the day ends just before 3 o'clock-ish. Now, Obviously, I got to school much earlier because I was used to having that time in the morning to get things done. But if I were to just work contract hours, it would be basically 7:15 to like 3 o'clock. Now, as a result, that means we do not have time built into our schedule for meetings. So when we have faculty meetings or like a leadership meeting or like a sunshine committee meeting, those all take place after school, after contract hours. So there are some days, like on Wednesdays, if we're having a faculty meeting, where I may be staying after school an extra hour because we don't have that built into our schedule. Now, in terms of planning time, when I taught in Maryland, I mentioned those morning chunks of time for planning. That was just like extra time, but our actual planning time during the day, we would get planning 4 out of 5 days a week for an hour. So 1 day a week, you would not have planning time, although you may have had it in the morning before students arrived. Here, we get 50 minutes of planning time, but it is every single day. So just a slight difference there. Originally, I was doing the math and I was thinking, oh, I have more planning time here. But in reality, I think if you include the extra planning time that we had in the morning in Maryland, that was probably a little bit more. Now, of my 5 days of planning that I get for 50 minutes, that is not all individual planning time. A lot of that is designated to like certain meetings or like grade level planning or like math and science planning as a team. So typically I would have like 3 of those days where I get individual planning time. Then I would have a grade level planning day and we would have like a math and science planning day. And then lunch and recess, similar but slight differences. When I taught in Maryland, we had 25 minutes duty-free lunch and then 25 minutes where we were monitoring students during recess. Here we have 30 minutes of duty-free lunch, meaning we are not watching after students. Of course, sometimes I have lunch bunches, but that's my choice. I have no responsibilities during that time. Then recess is only 20 minutes. And again, we are monitoring them during that time. So it's the same amount of time total, but instead of 25, it's 30 and 20. So that is it. At least that's all I'm gonna get into in this video. I have found that there are differences no matter what. As I mentioned, if you switch schools within a district, there will be differences. If you switch districts within a single state, there will be differences. And then obviously if you switch states, there will be differences as well. So I found that it's less to do with the actual state and more to do with like the specific area that you teach in, at least from my experience. Of course, there are certain things about teaching in Texas that are drastically different in terms of the testing, the standards, and then I'm not even getting into all of the legislation because I feel like that's constantly changing, but there can be a lot of differences between different states based on the legislation that is passed in that state. But I think in summary, my biggest takeaway from now teaching in different districts in Maryland and then now teaching in different states, there are pluses and minuses no matter where you go. And rather than focusing too much on that specific state or district, I feel like the school that you end up in can really make or break your experience. And so finding a school that really matches up with your values and your teaching style, where you can form a strong relationship with that community, is most important. And so I have been lucky enough to find a school and a district that I am honored to teach at and that I feel like really values me as an educator, and therefore it has made my return to teaching just the best. And I know I'm very lucky for that, and hopefully if you're watching this, you will find that for you as well. But if you did enjoy the video, please give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. As always, thank you for watching. I love you so much. Don't forget to put your positive pants on, and I will catch you in the next one.